So let's think about the language and the structure of the poem. Hitcher. Like a lot of Armitage's poetry, we get this language of speech, what I've said is colloquial language. Under the weather. The truth is blowing in the wind. I let him have it. I dropped it into third. Stitch that, I remember thinking. The poem is peppered with normal everyday speech. There's nothing grand about any of the language in this poetry, in this poem. In fact, that's how it differs slightly from Gooseberry Season, because at least in Gooseberry Season we do get that middle stanza about the watershed and then the weight, whatever turns and tips us over the razor's edge. We get a kind of a reflection in Gooseberry Season, the poet moving back, seeming to draw back away from the poem and somehow comment on that moment of where he flips from coping with the man in the house to no longer coping with him. But in Hitcher we don't get that at all. From beginning to end, it's the man seemingly talking to you. And because it's written in the language of speech, it sounds a bit like a confession, or at least a man who's telling you about something he's done. And you can almost imagine him having a chat down the pub, recounting a tale, recounting a story that he wants to tell to his friends. And that sets up quite a challenging contrast, in that he's seemingly telling us a story, and yet the story that he's telling us is really quite shocking. And we see it right from the start. I've been tired under the weather. You get that sense right from the very beginning that the man is kind of telling you a story, telling you something about his life. But the thing that he's telling is very, very challenging. It's very similar to Gooseberry Season and Alaska, which reminds me Gooseberry Season starts as if he's saying, oh yeah, there's another thing that I needed to tell you about. So really, when it comes to language, we need to mention that. We need to mention this colloquialism. And that colloquialism is a key theme of his poetry, of Armitage's poetry. And as I said in a previous podcast, it makes it quite accessible, but also quite challenging in many ways. Because there are no obvious similes or metaphors in this poem. And there's no obvious figurative language. The language is very, very simple. What about the structure? Well, it's told in stanzas of 5 lines each, and you can see a sort of pattern. You can see the way the first line is shorter than the second line, shorter than the third line, then it goes in and in again. It's each line. They're not exactly the same length of syllables in each stanza, but they're roughly the same. You've got sort of 4, 5, 6 in the first, so 7 or 8, 9 in the second, and so on. But why does Armitage do it? Why does he even bother to put the poem in seemingly reasonably ordered verses? Or maybe there's a sense of this man needing to control his life a bit, and maybe there's that element of outer control, that the Hitcher is somehow taking control of his life through this act of violence, and maybe the stanzas, the order of the stanzas sort of hints at that need for control. There's also something slightly childlike about the poem, particularly looking at some of the rhymes. You're finished fired, of Vauxhall Aster, it was hired. There's something slightly comical, I suppose, about some of the rhymes, which again counters, contrasts the content of the poem. So we've got this sort of slight order, this vague order, the 5 lines, the 5-line stanzas, and you've got this seemingly almost whimsical, humorous rhyme, and yet that's contrasted with a really brutal act. So I think if you write about this poem, it's important that you write about that contrast between form and content, between the way in which the poem was written and the language that's used and the act itself. Because I think that's where the core of this poem lies, in that contrast. It's hard to say much more about it, but certainly I think it's one of the most challenging poems that Armitage has written, certainly in this particular anthology.